Aloha spirit. It's always wonderful to be back in Hawaii, and I can't thank you enough that you came out tonight. You know, one of the truly intense pleasures of travel, as I'm sure many of you have discovered, is indeed the opportunity to live amongst those who have not forgotten the old ways, who still feel their past in the wind, touch it in stones polished by rain, taste it in the bitter leaves of plants. And just to know that in the Amazon, jaguar shamans still journey beyond the Milky Way, or that in the high Arctic, the myths of the Inuit elders still resonate with meaning, or that in the Himalaya, the Buddhists still pursue the breath of the Dharma, is to remember the central revelation of anthropology, and that is the idea that the world into which you were born does not exist in some absolute sense, but is just one model of reality, the consequence of one particular set of intellectual and adaptive choices that your lineage made, however successfully, many, many generations ago. But whether it is a voodoo acolyte in Haiti, a yak herder on the slopes of Chomolungma, Mount Everest, an eagle hunter of central Kazakhstan, or a thunderhoof nomad of Mongolia, all of these peoples teach us that there are other ways of being, other ways of thinking, other ways of orienting yourself in social, spiritual, and ecological space. And that's an idea that, if you think about it, can only fill you with hope. Now, together, the myriad of cultures of the world make up a kind of a social and a spiritual and ecological, intellectual web of life that envelops the planet and is as important to the well-being of the planet as is the network of biological life that you know so well as a biosphere. And you could think of this cultural web of life as being an ethnosphere. And you could define the ethnosphere as being the sum total of all thoughts and dreams, ideas and myths, intuitions and inspirations brought into being by the human imagination since the dawn of consciousness. The ethnosphere is humanity's great legacy. It's a symbol of all that we've achieved and the promise of all that we can achieve as a wildly creative and imaginative species. And just as the biosphere is being severely eroded with the loss of habitat and the concomitant loss of plant and animal life, so too is the ethnosphere, but if anything at a far greater rate. No biologist, for example, would dare suggest that 50% of all plants and animals are moribund or on the brink of extinction. Is simply not the case. And yet that, as Lyell's work teaches us, the most apocalyptic scenario in the realm of biological diversity scarcely approaches what we know to be the most optimistic scenario in the realm of cultural diversity. And the great indicator of this, of course, is language loss. When each of you were born, there were 7,000 languages spoken on Earth. Now, language is not simply a body of grammar or vocabulary. A language is a flash of the human spirit. It's a vehicle through which the soul of each particular culture comes into the material world. Every language is an old-growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an ecosystem of spiritual and social possibilities. And of those 7,000 languages spoken the day that you were born, as linguists now teach us, fully half aren't being whispered into the ears of infants, which means essentially that they're on the road to extinction. Now, there are many people who say, wait a minute, wouldn't the world be a better place if we all spoke one language? Wouldn't communication be facilitated? Wouldn't it be easier for us to get along? And my retort to that is always to say, what a brilliant idea. Let's make that universal language Nuktatak. Let's make it Lakota. Let's make it Haida. Let's make it Tibetan. And suddenly you begin to feel, as a native speaker of English, what it would be like to be enveloped in silence, to have no means or ability to pass on the wisdom of your ancestry or to anticipate the promise of your descendants. And yet that dreadful fate is indeed the fate or plight of somebody somewhere on Earth every fortnight, because on average every 2 weeks some elder passes away and carries with them into the grave the last syllables of an ancient tongue. Now, the reason that this is such a tragic trend is because it's happening in the very generation where science, in the guise of genetics, has finally proven it to be true, something that philosophers have always dreamt to be true. And that is the fact that we're all brothers and sisters. And I don't mean that in the spirit of hippie ethnography. I mean quite literally, we are all cut from the same genetic cloth. Genetics has shown that the human genetic endowment is a continuum. Race has been exposed as an utter fiction. We are all, in fact, as studies of the Y chromosome and the male descent line of humanity indicate, and studies of mitochondrial DNA in the female descent line of humanity suggest, we are all descendants of a handful of people who walked out of Africa some 60,000 years ago and then embarked on this extraordinary diaspora, a year of 40,000 years in the making, a mere 2,500 human generations that carried the human spirit to every single corner of the habitable world. But if you accept that truth of science, you must accept its corollary. If we're all cut from the same genetic cloth, it means by definition that all cultures share the same raw human genius, the same intellectual potential, the same capacity. And whether this genius is expressed, as has been the case in the West, in technological wizardry, or by contrast invested into unraveling the complex threads of memory inherent in a myth, is simply a matter of choice and cultural orientation. There is no progress in the affairs of culture. That old Victorian idea that there was a ladder to success that went from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized of the Strand. That there was this sort of pyramid of advancement that placed Victorian England at the apex of a structure that sloped down the sides of the so-called primitives of the world, has been thoroughly discredited by modern anthropology and revealed to be as much an artifact of the colonial era of the 19th century as a notion that clergymen had in that era, that the earth was only 6,000 years old. In this stunning affirmation of the human spirit and the interconnectedness of humanity, a story that is written in blood and bone, geneticists have proven it to be true, what all of us have always hoped to be true. And fundamentally what this means is that the other peoples of the world are not failed attempts at being you. They're not failed attempts at being modern. On the contrary, each culture is an answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when the myriad cultures of the world answer that question, they do so in 7,000 different voices. And those voices collectively become our human repertoire for dealing with the challenges that will confront us as a species in the ensuing millennia. The problem becomes, what do we do about this? When I was recruited to the National Geographic as an explorer in residence, this marvelous kind of oxymoronic sinecure, it was really part of the institution's conservation mission for its new century. And the challenge was, of course, if you identify in the realm of biological diversity in an area of high species endemism, you create a national park. But you can't create a protected area of the mind. Change is one constant in all cultures. All peoples are always dancing with new possibilities for life. So the challenge became, how do you address this crisis? And I was convinced that polemics are never persuasive and that politicians never lead us anywhere, but that storytellers can change the world. So I embarked a dozen years ago to go to places in the ethnosphere where the beliefs and practices were so inherently dazzling that you couldn't help but come away with a new appreciation of the wonder of culture. So for example, with my good friend Mathieu Ricard, we made a film called The Science of the Mind about Tibetan Buddhism. Now you may ask, why would you use that term science to describe a religion? Well, what is science but the empirical pursuit of the truth? What is Tibetan Buddhism but 2,500 years of direct empirical observation as to the nature of mind? Mathieu said to me once, Western science is too often a major response to trivial needs. We spend all of our lifetime trying to live to be 100 without losing our teeth. In Tibet, they spend all of their lifetimes trying to understand the nature of existence. He said that in America, billboards celebrate naked teenagers in underwear. The The billboards of Tibet, many walls, are prayers to the well-being of all sentient creatures. And so we embarked on these series of journeys, and perhaps the one that was so catalytic that will be very close to your own hearts was a journey that we made with Nainoa Thompson on the Hokulea through the greatest culture sphere ever brought into being by the human imagination. And that, of course, is the place you've chosen to live, which is Polynesia. And sailing on the Hokulea, named for the sacred star of Hawaii, with the Polynesian Voyaging Society, was one of the most remarkable experiences that I've had in my life. These, after all, are sailors who in the night sky can delineate and name 200-300 stars. These are sailors who can sense the presence of a distant set of islands beyond the horizon simply by watching the reverberation of waves across the hull of the vessel, knowing full well that every island group in the Pacific has its own unique refractive pattern that can be read with the same perspicacity with which a forensic scientist would read a fingerprint. These are sailors who, in the darkness of the hull of the vessel, can distinguish as many as 5 sea swells moving through the canoe at any one point in time, distinguishing those caused by local weather disturbances from the deep currents that pulsate across the Pacific, and can be followed with the same ease with which a terrestrial explorer would follow a river to the sea. Indeed, if you took all of the genius that allowed us to put a man on the moon and applied it to an understanding of the ocean, what you would get is Polynesia. But the most remarkable thing about this tradition is that it was based on dead reckoning. And dead reckoning means you only know where you are by remembering precisely how you got there. And it was the impossibility of using that technique on a long oceanic voyage that caused most European transports to hug the shores of continents until the British solved the problem of longitude with the invention of the chronometer. But we know for a scientific fact that 10 centuries before Christ, the ancestors of the Polynesians from a great civilization called Lapita set sail to the rising sun. Within 800, 900 years, they reached Samoa and Tonga, and then the journey stopped for 1,000 years. But then it began again. 4,000 kilometers all across the Central Pacific, through the Cook Islands and Society Islands, all the way to the Marquesas, eventually northwest to Hawaii, southeast to Rapa Nui, and eventually around the time of the First Crusade to New Zealand, or what we now know as being New Zealand. And all of this was based on dead reckoning in a society and a civilization that did not have the written word. And that implied that the Wayfinder, sitting monk-like on the stern of the vessel, had to remember over the course of a multi-week journey every shift of wind, every sign of the sea, the stars, the celestial bodies, every movement in the waves. And that's what the essence of this tradition was. And the marvelous metaphors Nainoa explained to me was that the ship itself did not move. It was the axis mundi of existence. And the genius of the Wayfinder was his ability, or her ability, to conjure out of the water of the islands. And so when Nainoa told me the story of when Hokulea first tried to pull out of the sea Rapa Nui, I mean, this is incredible. This implied a journey of 6,000 miles, crossing the doldrums, tacking to the wind for 2,500 miles, all to reach an island that was 25 kilometers across, less than a degree on a compass, had indeed a compass been on board the Hokulea. But there was no compass, there was no sextant, certainly no GPS. There was only the visionary realm of Wayfinder, and the hearts and dreams of an entire island nation, an entire civilization, waiting to be reborn upon the ocean swells. Now, if we leave the greatest water sphere to the greatest forest sphere, we enter the Amazon. Joseph Conrad once said of the tropical rainforest that it was less a forest than a primeval mob, a remnant of an ancient era of vegetation, rioted and consumed the world. And he spoke of the image that we had of the Amazon in the early parts of the 20th century, but this was not the vision held by the people of the Anaconda, the Barasana, the Makuna, the Tanimuko, people who believed that mythologically they came up the Milk River from the east in the belly of the sacred serpent, only to be regurgitated over the various banks of the affluents of the northwest Amazon. People who lived so closely to that forest that cognitively they did not distinguish the color blue from the color green, because the canopy of the heavens was equated to the canopy of the rainforest. Now, if we slip down the side of the Cordillera, we enter the homeland of some of the more remarkable societies that first informed the ethnographic vision of the Amazon. Societies like the Guarani, remarkable in part because they were first peacefully contacted in 1958, fully 5 years after I was born. In 1957, 5 missionaries attempted contact, and they made a critical mistake. They dropped from the air 8x10 glossy photographs and what we would say to be friendly gestures, forgetting that the people of the rainforest had never seen anything two-dimensional in their lives. So they looked behind the photographs, behind the face, to try to find the form to the figure, saw nothing, and concluded, not inaccurately, that these were calling cards of the devil, and they promptly speared the 5 missionaries to death. But the Guarani didn't simply spear each other. We traced genealogies back 8 generations and found 2 instances of natural death. And when we pursued the matter a little bit, they admitted that one of the fellows had gotten so old that he died getting old, so we speared him anyway. 54% of their mortality was due to these Hatfield and McCoy intra-tribal spearing raids. And at the same time, they were remarkable people. They were the first society in the Amazon ever to have medical attention at the time of contact. And what Western medicine revealed was an astonishingly healthy people. No vector diseases, no even bacterial infections. I met women who had been speared back to front in raids, and the spear points had missed vital organs. They had simply cut it off back to front, packed the wound with the mud of the peccary's watering hole. The tissue had become necrotic. The spear point slipped out like a splinter from the body. An amazingly healthy people. And they also had a knowledge of the forest that was incredible. Their hunters could smell animal urine at 40 paces and tell you what form of life had left that behind. Not because they were sauvage in some Rousseauian sense, but because they were true natural philosophers who had used all of the human genius to understand an ecosystem upon which their lives depended. And this knowledge of the forest is what first drew me to the Amazon. I was so very fortunate. You know, I've always lived in a way where I only have one word for any new experience, and that's yes. And I was a kid from British Columbia, and I had to go to university, and I was fighting forest fires during Vietnam, and all of our camps were full of these draft dodgers, and we were these obsequious, obedient Canadian lads. And people like you, or Americans, would tell our bosses to piss off, and it was absolutely charismatic. And one of them had the Life magazine with the Harvard student strike of 1969 on the cover. And in this kind of atavistic way, I thought, that's got to be the school you go to become cool like these guys. So I applied to Harvard, having no idea where it was. I got in, turned up there at Logan Airport, and I realized I really didn't know where it was. And I went to this character with a Harvard t-shirt on. I thought, he's got to know. He didn't know either. And I dragged my trunk. My family was too poor to take taxis, so I dragged my trunk through the subway system, got to Harvard Square in 1970. It was a caravanserai of insanity. The Hare Krishna here, the SDS over here. And then I realized my mom had made a mistake, and I was 2 weeks early and the dorms weren't open yet. I had no money, so I dragged my trunk through Cambridge until I found a church, and I knocked on the door. The pastor opened it up, and this seemed like a nice thing, except that he was a war resister, and his basement was full of weathermen about to escape to Canada, where I just come from. And so I was radicalized within 24 hours. And then I had to decide after a year at university what I was going to major in. And I happened the day before the deadline to walk. This is what I want you kids to really pay attention to. Because life's like this, in these magical moments. There are no plans in life. So I was walking through the Peabody Museum of Ethnology and all these dioramas, these fabulous shamans in these outfits. And I ran into a friend of mine in the streets. I said, well, what are you going to major in tomorrow? And he said, anthropology. And I said, what's that? You study about Indians. And I said, like Forrest Gump. I said, that'll do. And I became a student of anthropology. And then after a year and a half of just reading about Indians in books, I wanted to go to the Amazon. And I was in a cafe in Harvard Square with my roommate, a rough-cut diamond from Spokane, Washington, the only kid with a beat-up pickup truck in Harvard Square. There was a National Geographic map right in front of us, and David looked at the map, he looked at me, looked at the map, and he suddenly pointed to the Arctic. Well, I had to go somewhere. I lifted my hand and I pointed to the Amazon. Had it hit Italy, I might have become a Renaissance scholar. But having decided to go to the Amazon, there was only one man to see, the legendary botanical explorer Richard Evans Schultes, who shot blowguns in class and kept outside his door a bucket of peyote buttons available to his students as an optional laboratory experiment. This is the man for whom national parks and mountains have been named in South America the greatest Amazonian explorer of the 20th century, the man who sparked the psychedelic era with his discovery of the so-called magic mushrooms in Mexico in 1938. But he was an odd choice for a 60s icon because his politics were wildly conservative. He didn't vote for the Republican Party. He professed not to believe in the American Revolution. He always voted for Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. So at the age of 18, I went to see him, and I knocked on his fourth-floor Erie office at the Botanical Museum, and I got as far as saying, "Sir, I'm from British." Well, that's all it took. That British, one of his colleagues once said to him, the only way for Schultes to go native would be to go to London. So I said, "I'm from British Columbia. I've saved up money in a logging camp, and I want to go to the Amazon as you do, collect plants." Now, in Canada, I would have been thrown out of the office. But this man, who Prince Philip had called the father of the Amazon, simply peered through his antiquated bifocals over a mound of plant specimens. And at the time, I had never taken a biology course in my life. I knew nothing of South America. And he simply said to me, "Well, son, when do you want to go?" And 2 weeks later, I was in the Amazon, where I stayed for 15 months. And in order to placate my mother, who was a little old English lady back in Victoria, British Columbia, she insisted I go by his office before I left at the age of 18 to get some pointers before I went off to live in the Amazon for a couple of years. And he had 3 vital pieces of advice. He said, "Don't bother with leather boots because all the snakes bite at the neck." And then he said, "Don't forget to bring a pith helmet because in 12 years he had never lost his bifocals." And his 3rd piece of advice most assuredly did not placate my mum. He said, "Don't come back without trying ayahuasca, which is the most powerful of all hallucinogenic preparations of the shaman's repertoire." And then he handed me 2 letters that might as well have been written by God. And then he said, "Never forget Paracelsus, the great Swiss physician. Paracelsus always said, the difference between a poison, a narcotic, a medicine, and a hallucinogen is just dosage." So we became really attuned to finding any plants that had biodynamic properties. And this was a great lesson of Schultes. You know, plants like this have been used by a friend of mine from the Kofan, the flying death, curare, the arrow poisons that transformed modern medicine in the 1940s when D-tubocurare, the muscle relaxant, was extracted from them. And this invariably led you into the realm of the shaman. Now, if you pursue the academic work of great scholars such as Shirley MacLaine, you would think that the shaman is a kind of benign figure with feathers and bells. I've been with a lot of shaman in my life. I've never met one who wasn't a little psychotic. As Joseph Campbell said, that's their job. I mean, they're the ones who swim in the mystic waters the rest of us would drown in. They're the ones who go in these metaphysical spaces that most of us raising our kids happily want to avoid. And the essence of the shamanic art of healing is based on a very different notion as to the origin and nature of disease. Disease is not defined as the presence of pathogens as much as a state of disequilibrium where the physical and spiritual components do not find their proper rest. Health, by contrast, is a state of continuity and wholeness and equilibrium. And the word health actually comes from the same Anglo-Saxon root hail, meaning oneness and completeness. And of course, the essence of the shamanic art of healing is invoking some technique of ecstasy to soar away on the wings of trance, get into those distant metaphysical realms where you can indeed work your gestures of medical, magical, mystical rescue. And that accounts for one of the most curious anomalies in botanical science, and that is the fact that of the 120 known hallucinogenic plants in the world, 95% are from the Americas. Not because the forests of equatorial West Africa or Southeast Asia are depauperate, but simply because people there had other avenues to the divine. In the Americas, the root to the Godhead were these curious plants, like this one being used by the Yanomami in the upper Orinoco of Venezuela. Epide, the semen of the sun, derived from the blood-red resin of several species in the genus Virola in the nutmeg family. These powders are chock full of serotonin-like tryptamines, 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine, dimethyltryptamine. To have this stuff blown up your nose is rather like being shot out of a rifle barrel lined with Baroque paintings and landing on a sea of electricity. In fact, I used to argue with Schultes that you couldn't classify this as hallucinogenic because by the time you were under its influence, there was no one home anymore to experience hallucinations. But the reason we're drawn to these plants is not simply their dazzling pharmacological properties, but what they tell us about a different way of knowing. Now, the reason the Yanomami blow those snuffs up the nose is because those tryptamines are orally inactive, because they're denatured by an enzyme found in the human stomach called monoamine oxidase. Tryptamines can only be taken orally if taken in conjunction with some other plant compound that denatures the MAO in the human gut. Well, it turns out that when you turn to ayahuasca, the most powerful of these preparations, it consists of the leaves of a nondescript shrub in the coffee family, Psychotria viridis, chock full of these tryptamines, but also the woody bark of the liana, Banisteriopsis capi, full of these beta-carbolines, harmine and harmaline, which are MAO inhibitors of the precise sort necessary to potentiate the tryptamines. Now, you kids don't have to worry about that chemistry, but I do want you to think about this. How did these Indians, in a forest that had 80,000 species of plants, learn to combine these two morphologically distinct denizens of the rainforest to create this biochemical version of the whole integrated with some of the parts? The only scientific explanation is trial and error, which is quickly exposed as a meaningless euphemism. You ask the Indians, and they say the plants teach us. Well, what does that mean? When Schultes was with the Siona Sequoia in 1941, he identified 17 varieties of the liana, all of which were referable to his Harvard-trained eye as the same species. But the Indians explained the essence of their classification. They said that you take each one of the 17 on the night of a full moon, and each one sings to you in a different key. Well, that's not going to get you a PhD in plant systematics at the University of Hawaii or at Harvard, but it's a lot more interesting than counting flower parts. It also speaks to another way of knowing. And this is a great lesson. Just when academics think they know, they don't know. You grew up hearing about the Amazon, that it was this fragile place that could endure our ways only so long. And at some level that was true, because ecologists quite properly instructed that in a temperate rainforest, of course, the periodicity of the seasons, the leaf litter creates this rich organic material that is kind of the capital of the ecosystem, whereas in a tropical rainforest with a high rate of decomposition, humidity, and temperatures, leaf litter decays as it hits the forest floor, so the wealth of the ecosystem is the living vegetation, which if you remove, sets in motion a chain reaction of biological destruction of cataclysmic consequences. That little rap began every scientific paper I wrote in the 70s, and it was utterly and totally wrong. What we now realize is that it's a decent way of understanding the distinction between those two fundamental ecosystems, but when applied to a landmass 7 times the size of Ontario, it's as much as slogan as science. We now know in the Amazon that Indians didn't slash and burn and move on, they slashed, burn, and stayed put. There are areas in the Amazon collectively the size of France, of rich black organic soils of human origins. What happened is that by the time anthropologists came into the Amazon, the majority of the population had been dead for 400 years. So we were attracted to the real Indians, like the Wahanis, small societies, isolated, living in open conflict with their neighbors. And this it reinforced our environmental sense of what a fragile place it had been. And we were all collectively blind to the first account of Aureliana. When Aureliana went down in 1541, he didn't describe an empty forest. He described a forest that was filled not with hundreds of thousands, but millions of indigenous people. And the question that has always haunted anthropology, is there a place where the echo of those ancient civilizations can still be heard? And the answer is that there is, and it's in the homeland of the people of the Anaconda. The Barasana live in these longhouses which in their architectural elaboration and mythological significance rival anything the Inca or the Maya built. These are societies based on wisdom traditions where the warrior is less important than the man of knowledge. These are societies that have social structures that facilitate peace, not war, not the least of which is that you must marry someone who speaks a different language. And so in any one longhouse, you'll have 6 and 7 languages spoken, but you never hear a child practicing a distinct tongue. They simply wait, watch, and listen, and when they begin to speak. And what we've come to understand is that the mythologies of the Vadasana are nothing more or less than a complex land management plan dictating exactly how human beings in great numbers can live in that forest. And the reason it's so powerful an idea is that in the 1970s, these societies were doomed. Missionaries had entered their land. And then in 1991, Martin von Hildebrand, with the support of the Colombian government, secured legal land tenure to an area the size of the United Kingdom for 57 ethnicities. And behind that veil of security and isolation, with the federal state distracted by the war on drugs, a whole new dream of culture was born. And when we went back at the invitation of the peoples of Paraná to make a film, we brought with us halfway through Stephen Hugh Jones, the head of anthropology at Cambridge, who in the 1970s, he had devoted his life to the cosmology of the Vadasana, but in the 1970s he participated in a BBC strand called Disappearing Worlds, predicting the demise of these cultures. And so when he flew in halfway through this incredible ceremony, where there were 250 men in full ritual regalia, taking ayahuasca for 3 days and 3 nights, with all the women and children, he got on the phone to his wife back in Cambridge and said, "Christine, you won't believe my eyes. The only thing that disappeared are the fucking missionaries." Now, what we now realize is how precious the vision of the Vadasana have for our understanding of the Amazon rainforest. The rainforest, incidentally, the size of the face of the full moon. So, I mentioned Schultes, and he was a dream weaver. And one of the other things he said to me before I left his office at the age of 18 was that I should look up his man in Colombia, his protege, Timothy Plowman, and he had done for Timothy the impossible, the dream academic assignment of the 1970s, $250,000 and a brand new Dodge Power Wagon red pickup truck to study a plant known to the Inca as the divine leaf of immortality, coca, the notorious source of cocaine. And it was an extraordinary assignment because even though that plant had yielded the most important topical anesthetic in Armamentia medica, and even though it was consumed every day by millions of South American Indians, so little was known about it. Nobody knew how many species yielded the alkaloid, no one knew its point of origin, no one had ever done a nutritional study of this plant. We knew that in the time of the Inca it had been revered as no other plant. You could not enter a holy shrine without the plant in your mouth. Unable to cultivate it at the elevation of the imperial capital of Cusco, the Inca replicated it in gold and silver leaf in fields that colored the landscape. Indeed, no field could be harvested, no elder led into the realm of the dead, no child brought into the realm of the living without some gesture of reciprocity of the energy of this plant. And we did do something which actually horrified our backers at the US government. We did do the first nutritional study of coca, and we found it had a small amount of the alkaloid in it, 0.5 to 1% dry weight, roughly the amount of caffeine you'd find in a coffee bean. And no one noticed the irony that at every drug abuse conference, all the narcs bolted for the coffee pot at 10 o'clock in the morning. But in addition to the small amount of alkaloid absorbed benignly in the mucous membrane of the mouth, the plant was chock full of vitamins. It had more calcium than any plant ever studied by science, which made it perfect for a diet that lacked a dairy product. It even had enzymes which enhanced the body's ability to digest carbohydrate at high elevation, which made it perfect for the tuber-based diet of the Andes. So in one elegant assay, Timothy put in the stark profile the draconian efforts that are underway to this day to eradicate the traditional fields, and he showed that this was a plant that had been used with no evidence of toxicity, let alone addiction, for over 4,000 years. And so with coca as my lens, both metaphorically and literally, the rhythms of the Andes slowly came into focus. And I became very interested in this idea of sacred geography. And again, I don't mean that in the spirit of hippie ethnography. What does it mean when people actually believe that the earth is alive? Now, when Descartes famously reduced all of existence to mind and material, Leading science, as Saul Bellow said, to make a house cleaning of belief, we threw out all notions of myth, metaphor, mysticism, and magic that actually had created comfort for human beings throughout much of art history. And so I was raised in Canada to believe that a mountain was a pile of rock ready to be mined. That made me fundamentally different than my godson outside of Chinchero, in Cusco in Chinchero in Peru, raised to believe that a mountain was a deity, an apu that would direct his destiny. I was raised to believe that our rainforest existed to be cut. That was the essence of the ideology, the scientific ideology of forestry that I was taught in school and practiced as a logger in the forests of British Columbia. That made me very different than my friends from the First Nations, raised in those same forests, to believe that they were the abode of Hukuk and the crooked beak of heaven and the cannibal spirits at the north end of the world that had to be embraced during the Hametza initiation, such that the wisdom of the wild would come back to the community in the potlatch. The issue isn't who's right and who's wrong, it's how the belief system has consequences in terms of the ecological footprint of the culture. My particular worldview eradicated those forests within 3 generations, whereas the First Nations of British Columbia had lived there happily for thousands of years. So I began to really pay attention to these ideas. And in Peru, where everything is based on reciprocity, there are these fantastic localized and pan-Andean rituals to reaffirm this fundamental conviction. In the community where I've lived for 35 years and done research, once each year a fantastic thing happens. The fastest young boy, as a runner, of each hamlet is given the honor of becoming a woman. And for one day he puts on the traje, the clothing of his sister, and he becomes a wailaka, a transvestite. And he has to lead all able-bodied men on a run. But it's not your ordinary run. You start off at 11,500 feet. You run 2,000 feet down to the base of the sacred mountain, and then you run to 16,000 feet, only to fall away on the backside of the sacred valley, and then to cross 2 more soaring Andean ridges over the course of a very long day. The metaphor is clear. The wailaka at every mound of earth or ito or pone that marks and delineates the perimeter of the community land must spin to bring the vortex of the feminine to the mountaintop. Coca is given the Pachamama, libations of alcohol to the wind. And the metaphor is that you go into the mountain as an individual, but through sacrifice. And remember that the word sacrifice comes from the Latin meaning to make sacred. You fuse into a single entity, a single social and cultural pulse that emerges from the mountains together to reaffirm your sense of belonging and your obligations to that piece of land. Now, at the age of 48, I became the oldest man ever to run this race and the only outsider ever to do so. And I can assure you that I only got through it by chewing more coca leaves in one day than anyone in the 4,000-year history of the planet. But what really got me through it was that I had baptized children in that village for 30 years, and I bought more cows than you can imagine for families. And when all my ahijados and ahijadas realized that the padrino was stupid enough to run the movimiento at the age of 48, they all came out and clung to me like limpets. They weren't about to let anything happen to their cash cow. These localized rituals become pan-Andean in these great festivals like that of the Coyeriti, where once each year, tens of thousands of Andean people converge on a sacred mountain known as the Sinicara that's dominated by the 3 tongues of the Cocapunca Glacier. It's a perfect expression of the reality of the pan-Andean world, 500 years of Catholic faith on top of pre-Columbian antecedents. And so the symbolism is very Catholic. You bring the crosses from your community church up into the sacred valley on pilgrimage, following the stations of the cross, but always in the shadow of the most sacred mountain of the Inca, Ausangati. The crosses are placed in the ice, as you can see here on the right. Great ritual events happen for 24 hours, and then the Pablitos carry the crosses down. But these contemporary ceremonies can even inform our understanding of iconic archaeological sites. Who here has been to Machu Picchu? Okay, great. I'm sure it was described to you as a lost city. It was a lost city only in the early marketing strategies and scheming of the National Geographic. There is nothing lost about Machu Picchu whatsoever. You simply have to look around and see the network of royal roads that linked it in to the 20,000 miles of roads that the Inca built in less than a century. But more importantly, Machu Picchu is linked to these archaic and essential notions of sacred geography. You all went to see this abstract stone, the Intihuatana, what Bingham called the hitching post of the sun. My close friend and colleague, Johann Reinhard, who discovered the ice maiden, the perfectly preserved Incaic maiden on the top of Pato, is the world's expert on Andean notions of sacred geography. And he was the first to notice that the light that falls in the Intihuatana always echoes the light on the Apu, or the deity of Machu Picchu, which is Huayna Picchu, the sugar loaf behind. Come this side of the Intihuatana, you find an altar. Go to the top of Huayna Picchu, you find another altar. Do a direct north-south bearing, and you find, to your astonishment, the bearing bisects the Intihuatana, and it goes right to the heart on the horizon of Salcantay, the second of the most sacred Apus of the Incan Empire, the source of all the water that flows into Machu Picchu. When the Southern Cross is in the southernmost extent of the sky, enmeshed in the Milky Way, it is right on top at the December solstice on the same trajectory. The Milky Way for the Inca is the heavenly equivalent of the most sacred river, the Urubamba, the Vilcanota, like a serpent comes around the base of Machu Picchu. But where is this river born? In the ice fields of the Coyoliti. So 500 years after Christ, rituals are occurring every spring when the Pleiades emerge in the sky that echo the very concepts and notions that led to the creation by Pachacuti of his great Incaic estate at Machu Picchu. Now, if the Andean world is kind of a syncretic world that brings together these two worlds, there's one place in South America where the pre-Columbian voice is still heard utterly unfettered, and that is in the massif of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta that soars out of the Caribbean coastal plain of Colombia to 20,000 feet. The people who live there call themselves the Elder Brothers. These are the descendants, the Kogi, the Anahuacos, the Wiwa, and the Cancuano, descendants of the ancient Tairona civilization which carpeted that Caribbean coastal plain. In the wake of the conquest, the survivors fled into these mountains, where to this day they remain ruled by a ritual priesthood. The training for the priesthood, as was reported in the 1940s, was astonishing. The young acolytes are taken away from their families at the age of 3 and 4, sequestered in the shadowy world of darkness for 2 9-year periods, each to mimic the 9 months you spend in your natural mother's womb. Now metaphorically you're in the womb of the Great Mother. And for that entire time the world only exists as an abstraction, as you're taught the values of your society, which include the absolute conviction that your prayers and rituals maintain the balance of the world. And after the 18th year, suddenly, as a young man who's never seen a horizon, is taken on a pilgrimage to the heart of the world, and the priest who trains him says, you see, it's as I've told you all these years, it's yours to protect. Now that account, which had never been verified by ethnographic experience, became almost a fable in anthropology. I heard about it in 1974. I always wanted to know whether it was true. And then a truly magical thing happened. This young man walked into my office at the National Geographic with Carolina Barco, the Colombian ambassador, and he had 3 priests with him, and they never wear shoes, so it was February, and they didn't speak a word of Spanish or shoeless. And my house in Washington has actually become their embassy, and they come up and they're like Baroque Tibetans. I mean, they're very earnest, and my wife doesn't speak any Spanish, but she's very cool about these indulgences of mine. They chew more coca leaves than anyone in the world, and whereas in the Southern Andes there's quite a protocol, they ridicule those who stuff leaves like horses eating hay. Well, these folks actually do eat coca like horses eating hay. And I remember Gail called me once, just finally a little indignant because the vacuum cleaner broken down because of the sheer quantity of coca leaves to be cleaned up. But the marvelous story is that this man, whose name is Danilo Villafana, walked into my office, and in the middle of his presentation, I said, I don't mean to be rude, but you look an awful lot like an old friend of mine. And then I showed him this photograph I had taken in 1974. The man on the right, as you can see, was his father, Alberto, who was murdered by the paramilitaries. The man on the left, his cousin Eugenio, is now this revered elder from the left. And I said, Danilo, you may not remember this, but when you were a baby, I carried you on my back up and down the slopes of the mountains with your father and mother. And based on that incredible connection, he invited us to go on a journey to the heart of the world with the film crew. So we documented this incredible journey. And what we discovered is that today the acolytes don't spend all the 18 years in the darkness, but they do spend all of the 18 years in the environs of the men's circle, on a highly ritualized diet. And much of the time, indeed, in the darkness, learning the Baroque ideas of this society. And then, indeed, they are taken on a journey to the heart of the world, from the ocean to the ice, from the ice to the ocean. The entire journey, every ripple in the landscape resonates with mythological significance. Even the hats the men wear, woven from sisal, are an attempt to echo the snowfields that embrace the flanks of Saranqua, the goddess of the world. And we did this expedition, and because we were working in collaboration with the indigenous organization, our itinerary was well known, and we reached the penultimate stage of the pilgrimage when we suddenly found the elders and the mamos in divination in a circle, and when they prayed, the metaphor for this culture is a loom. They say, upon this loom I weave my life. They refer to their movements up and down the mountain as threads, so that over the course of a lifetime, exploiting various ecological niches, you weave a cloak over the body of the Great Mother. And when they pray, they do this with their fingers to simulate the spinning of yarn as ideas are spun out into the universe. And we found all these men in a circle very seriously praying. And it turns out the FARC had come through that valley an hour before, expecting to kidnap us. And so we had to get away. You don't really have a dramatic escape on a mule. You kind of clip-clop your way to rescue. But what was cool is that we were able to simply hand our high-definition cameras to the Wiwa and the Kogi, who we, at their request, were trained in cinematography. They finished that aspect of the film, and the Bollywood director and the rest of us went back down to the coast, where even though these sacred sites are now, in some cases, plugged by concrete structures, it doesn't stop the elder brother from doing the ritual gestures that are deemed to be necessary to keep the world as it is. They call themselves the Elder Brothers and speak in full paragraphs and sentences about our desperate need to change the way we interact with the planet. And it's humbling to think that even as we sit here in Hawaii, this other great zone of cultural resonance, the 2 hours from Miami Beach, the Elder Brother are constantly praying for the well-being of the world. Now, I've always kind of worked from the adage of Marshall McLuhan that if it works, it's obsolete. And just when I spent 4 years in the Americas thinking only about plants, I became kind of desperate for a new challenge. And there was always something waiting in the fourth floor eyrie of Professor Schultes. And one winter day in February of 1982, he summoned me to his office and asked me very casually whether I was interested in going down to the Caribbean island nation of Haiti, infiltrating the secret societies and securing the formula of a drug used to make zombies. Well, naturally, I said sure. And I went down to Haiti thinking that it would consume a fortnight of my spring vacation. And in the end, of course, it consumed 4 years of my life, because the minute I entered the African reality, something was made available to me that had eluded me in 4 years in the Amazon, and that was truly a window wide open to the mystic. You know, it's interesting, were I to ask you to name the great religions of the world, what would you say? Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, whatever. There's always one continent left out, sub-Saharan Africa. The tacit assumption being that African people south of the Sahara had no religion. Well, of course they did. And voodoo is not a black magic cult. The word voodoo is simply a word from the phone language of Dahomey, which means spirit or God. And in many ways, voodoo is a quintessentially democratic faith, because it, like all religions, attempts to deal with the inexorable mystery of death, and it attempts to deal with the fact that the living give birth to the dead become the spirits of multiple expressions of a greater God. But in this quintessentially egalitarian culture, even the dead must be made to serve the living. To serve the living, they must become manifest. To become manifest, they must respond to the rhythm of the drums. Come back from beneath the great water to displace the soul of the living, so that for that brief shining moment, human being and God become one and the same. That's the essence of spiritual possession. It's not some kind of psychic breakdown as Western psychologists have described it. It is in fact, for the African, the sign of divine grace when human beings and God become one and the same. That's why Africans will say to you, you white people go to church and speak about God, we dance in the temple and become God. And whether it's in Dahomey or whether it's in Haiti or other parts of the Afro-Caribbean reality in this continent, people walk in and out of their spirit realm with an ease and impunity that astonishes the ethnographic observer. And because you're taken by a spirit, you cannot be harmed. And so you see these theatrical gestures that can be frightening to people, cutting into the flesh with a razor, or more profoundly in Haiti, voodoo acolytes in a state of trance handling burning embers with impunity, a rather astonishing example of the mind's ability to affect the body that bears it when catalyzed in a state of extreme excitation. Now, I won't give you the details of this investigation, except to say that I was able to find a drug implicated in the zombie phenomena, a neurotoxin roughly 160,000 times stronger than cocaine as an anesthetic, 1,000 times stronger than potassium cyanide. And when I will share a funny story. When I came back on Easter Sunday of 1982, I had a suitcase made of surplus tin 7-Up cans from Saudi Arabia with Arabic script, and the suitcase was filled with all the stages of the poison's elaboration, including dried toads, dried fish, a human skull, plenty of plants in all the various stages. I had a live Bufo marinus toad, the largest toad in my backpack. This is something you couldn't get away with post 9/11. And I had no permits whatsoever. And you kids have to kind of put your fingers in your ears, because I'm just going to quote your customs guy. So this is not something you should say in school, all right? So I had no permits. It was Easter Sunday at JFK Airport. I just opened this suitcase in front of the customs guy, and he slammed it shut. And this, I'm just quoting your representative. He said, "Look, it's Easter fucking Sunday. I didn't even want to fucking work today. I don't know who the fuck you are. Just get the fuck out of here." And that's actually truthfully how the zombie poison came into America. I will always say this. The fantastic thing about it is it took a phenomenon that had been used and exploited in an explicitly racist way to denigrate people, and it made sense out of sensation. Why do we think of voodoo as something evil? Not because it had anything to do with culture, everything to do with the fact that Haiti was the only independent black country for 100 years. It was a thorn in the side of an imperialistic age. It funded revolutionary struggles in Gran Colombia. It bought shipments of slaves destined to the American South, granted them their freedom. It was this amazing place that the U.S. Marines occupied in 1920. And they stayed for 20 years. Most of the Marines came from the American South during the era of Jim Crow. Everybody above the rank of sergeant got a book contract. The books had names like Cannibal Cousins, Black Baghdad, Voodoo Fire in Haiti, A Puritan in Voodoo Land, The Magic Island, White King of Lagonav. All these books were filled with children bred for the cauldron, voodoo pins and needles and dolls that don't exist, zombies crawling out of the grave to attack you. They gave rise to the RKO movies of the 40s, Night of the Living Dead, Zombies in the Stratosphere, Zombies on Broadway, and they essentially said to the American people during the era of segregation that any place where such abomination occurred can only find its redemption through military occupation. That's why we think of voodoo as evil. Voodoo is simply the religion of Africa. It's the most extraordinary, sublime religious faith that I've ever encountered in all of my travels. So, this photograph hopefully says that. So in the end, we sort of have a question, what kind of world do we want to live in? We have this kind of conceit that these cultures, quaint and colorful as they may be, are destined to fade away as if by natural law, as if they're failed attempts at being us, failed attempts at being modern. Nothing could be further from the truth. Technology is no threat to culture. Lakota did not cease being Sioux when they gave up the bow and arrow for the rifle any more than an American farmer stopped being American when he gave up the horse and buggy for the automobile. It's not technology nor change that threatens the integrity of culture. It is power. These are, in every case, not frail peoples, but dynamic living peoples being driven out of existence by identifiable forces. And that's actually an optimistic observation because it suggests that human beings are the agents of cultural destruction. We can be the facilitators of cultural survival. So what are these forces that affect culture? Well, as Lyle said I wrote a book called The Serpent and the Rainbow that was made into the worst Hollywood movie in history. Hemingway said that if you write a book for Hollywood, you should sell a book to Hollywood. You should start off in Arizona, drive to the California state line, throw the book over, and go back to Tucson and have a drink. I didn't do that. I slipped away into the forests of Borneo. I always wanted to live in a place wet with the innocence of birth. I wanted to live with nomadic peoples of the rainforest because we were all once nomads. It was only 12,000 years ago that we succumbed to the cult of the seed, and the poetry of the shaman became the prose of the organized priesthood. Nomadic societies are profoundly different. How do you measure wealth in a place where there's a disincentive to accumulate anything? Well, in this society, wealth is explicitly defined as a strength of social relations between people, because if they fray, everybody suffers. There's no word for thank you in the Penan language because sharing is an automatic reflex. You never know who will be the next to bring food to the encampment. I once gave a cigarette to a little Penan woman and watched in my amazement. She tore it apart to distribute the individual strands of tobacco equitably to every hut in the encampment, rendering the product useless, honoring her obligation to share. Similarly, these are non-written traditions. Now, we take writing as this great advance of civilization, and it was, but by definition, writing is a device to numb memory. And in non-written or oral traditions, the memory is acute, and indeed the entire language and knowledge of the people is encoded in the vocabulary of the best storyteller. So in the same way that you can hear the voices of a character when you read a novel, I've always found in oral traditions people being able to have a dialogue with the natural world, such as in the case of the Penan, the flight of a hornbill becomes a cursive script of nature, like a vocabulary written on the wind. And sadly, by the time I got to Borneo in the late 80s, the sound of the forest had become the sound of machineries. At a time when we were so concerned about the Amazon, 45% of the world's tropical log exports were coming from Sarawak. And so in a single generation, rivers that once ran clear became so laden with silt that it seemed as if half of Borneo was slipping to the South China Sea, where the Japanese freighters hung light on their horizon, ready to fill their holds with raw logs ripped from the forest. Children raised in the forest suffering now from diseases in these government settlement camps. Women completely overwhelmed, men humiliated, eventually standing up in this quixotic gesture, blowpipes against bulldozers, but no power match for the power of the Malaysian state. And when I was in Tibet 5 years ago, a friend of mine, a linguist working with the Penan, sent me an email to let me know that the last nomadic Penan had been forced into the settlement camps. And so in a single generation, a way of life morally inspired, inherently right, had fallen along with the force that gave it birth. And these egregious gestures do not just happen in distant lands. This is my closest friend in Canada, a Tahltan leader by the name of Oscar Dennis. This is a photograph that appeared in the National Geographic. And I must say, as a complete aside, women from all around the world made a beeline for his community of Iskut, 7 hours north of the nearest village of Smithers, 1,200 miles north of Vancouver. And Oz would call me up and say, you know, wait, there's this woman from Moscow coming to see me. And I'd say, man, I mean, like we're brothers, right? And I'd say, man, you just had someone from Poland last week. I know. Well, you don't speak Polish or Russian. They don't really come for conversation. But on a more serious note, Oscar lives in a place called the Sacred Headwaters, which is under siege of a tsunami of economic development. And when I went to meet the Premier of British Columbia, a man I admired, I was astonished to find out that A, he had never been to a quarter of the province, an area the size of Oregon, even as he was signing off on these industrial initiatives that were going to compromise the well-being of the Tahltan people. And I said to him, let me tell you about my friend Oscar. In the last 5 years, one brother hung himself in his basement of his mother's house. Another brother died 10 feet from shore because he couldn't swim. A third brother was killed in medical malpractice, accused of being a drunk Indian when he had an epileptic seizure. Oscar's sister died of drugs and prostitution on the streets of Prince George. And Oscar's only daughter blew her head off playing Russian roulette with a handgun. I said to the Premier, in those 5 years, Barrick Gold has taken 400 tons of gold and 5,000 tons of silver at a market value of $25 billion out of their territory that legally is their territory by every definition of British and Canadian law. And I want to know why there's not a hockey rink in Iskut, why there's not a swimming pool, why there's not an elders center, why there aren't trust funds for kids who go to college. So it's not just about being against mines, it's about how many mines, at what pace, at what cost to the environment, and for whose benefit. And so Oscar and the Tahltan have rallied to keep Royal Dutch Shell and various mining companies out of the sacred headwaters where 3 of our most important salmon rivers of home, the Stikine, the Skene, and the Nass, are born. And the thing that, as a Canadian, I find astonishing is what does it take to get a mining company together in my country? You get on a golf course, that's where they usually meet, and you cobble together a company with less history than my dog. And as long as you get online and secure the subsurface rights to a place you've never been, the stories you've never heard, the pain of a long winter you've never experienced, and as long as you can guarantee the government the flow of revenue and taxation or royalties, you get the right to destroy the place forever. But there's not a single metric in the capitalist that industrializes a while that places any value on the land left alone, or any cost to the rest of us who aren't invested in that community, in that enterprise, implicit in its destruction. We take that for granted in the industrial West, but it's highly anomalous when viewed through the anthropological lens. It's a little bit like if you're selling plumeria flowers in your garden in Honolulu, and I come along and say, well, I'll buy all your flowers. In fact, I'm such a nice guy, I'll employ your kids to pluck all the flowers. And as I walk away with all your blossoms, I say, by the way, I'm destroying your house. And you say, who's going to pay for that? Well, that's not my problem. This is a transaction about flowers. It's coal, it's gas. And you leave it. World. And the Tahltan don't believe that. Oscar's father once said to me that there should be a rule that before any mine goes ahead, the kids of every one of the executives has to come and meet our kids. We'll put the kids aside and I'll cut a deal. For every tree that gets cut in Tahltan land, a rose bush in the executive's wife's garden will be cut down in Vancouver. For every drop of toxic waste that goes into their rivers, a drop of toxic waste will go into the swimming pool at the rec center where their kids recreate. Now, to the urban ear, that seems ridiculous, but it's exactly what the First Nations feel, because for them, this is not a wild resource to be exploited. It's a homeland, and they believe sincerely that the people with the greatest rights to that land are the generations as yet unborn. And I want to stress that that point of view is the dominant point of view in human societies. Our point of view is anomalous. And to illustrate this, let's go to a land where I just returned from yesterday, Australia. You know, when the British first arrived in Australia, they saw people that looked strange, had a simple technology, but really offended them above the Aborigines, is the Aborigines had no interest in improving upon their lot. And since improvement and progress was the ethos of Victorian England, in their inimitable way, the British concluded the Aborigines weren't human beings and began to shoot them. And as recently as 1902, it was debated in the Parliament in Melbourne as to whether Aboriginal people were human beings or not. As recently as the 1960s, when I was in school, a school book in Australia called The Treasury of Fauna of Australia included the Aborigines as amongst the interesting forms of wildlife in the country. But what was in fact going on was a subtle devotional philosophy beyond the reach of the British to understand, and that was the dreaming. We know from studies of the Y chromosomes that the ancestors of the Aboriginals were the first people to walk out of Africa. In 5,000 years, they crossed the underbelly of Asia, crossed the water that even then separated New Guinea from what we now call Australia, and then they encountered the most parsimonious continent on Earth, and they went walking. And in 10,000 years, they established 10,000 clan territories, all of which were linked by an idea, the song line, which is a trajectory walked at the dawn of time of the ancestral beings who sang the world of being, and the dreaming. And the dreaming wasn't a dream. It was a state of perpetual reality where past, present, and future fused into one. In not one of the 670 dialects and languages of Australia was there a word for past, present, or future. There was no word for time. The dreaming was a state whereby the world both existed and yet was constantly waiting to be born in the realm of the dreaming. And the entire purpose of life in Australia was not to improve upon anything, but it was a culture of stasis where the entire thrust of existence was to do the ritual gestures deemed to be necessary to keep the world exactly as it was at the time of its creation. It would be as if all of human thought in the West had gone into pruning the shrubs in the Garden of Eden to keep it just as it was when Adam and Eve had their fateful conversation. Now, the interesting thing is not to say who's right and who's wrong, but to see that both views had consequences. Had we followed this trajectory, yes, we would not have put a man on the moon, but we also wouldn't be talking about climate change and our capacity to change the biological life support systems of the planet. Now, if egregious industrial intrusions are one threat to culture, perhaps the most diabolical is ideology. You know, this is a photograph I took of a Buddhist nun in Angkor Wat who, during the era of Pol Pot, had her hands and feet severed from her body for the crime of pursuing her religious faith. And if we go into the mountains of Tibet, where I just was a month ago, we'll see the real consequences of this insane Marxist materialist ideology that was invented by a German philosopher and distilled in the reading room of the British Library, a set of beliefs so idiotic that they'd be laughable if they hadn't caused so much agony for the world. And when the Dalai Lama, as a young man, met Mao Zedong, incidentally, the human being who was responsible for the death of more people in his own culture in his lifetime than Hitler and Stalin put together. And when Mao Zedong famously said that all religion was poison, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama knew what to expect. And when the final conquest of Tibet occurred in 1959, 1.2 million people were killed for their religious faith. 6,000 structures of religious devotion were torn apart and blasted from the air. Can you imagine, as Americans, how you'd feel if some inordinately more powerful nation came in, defined all your religious aspirations to be anathema, and then began to kill all your churchmen, tear apart all your churches, your mosques, your synagogues? That's exactly what happened in Tibet. But what was it about the Buddhist Dharma that so threatened the Marxist materialists of Beijing? Well, the Dharma is distilled in the Four Noble Truths. All life is suffering. By that, the Buddha didn't mean that all life is negation. He just meant shit happens. The second of the Noble Truths is that the cause of suffering is ignorance. By that, the Buddha didn't mean stupidity. He meant the tendency of human beings to cling to the cruel illusion of their own centrality in the stream of divine existence. The third of the Noble Truths was a revelation that ignorance could be overcome, and the fourth and the most consequential was the delineation of a contemplative practice that, if followed, not only had a possibility of a transformation of the human heart, but had 2,500 years of empirical evidence that such a transformation should happen. So this is why we made this film, The Science of the Mind, with my friend Mathieu Ricard, who many of you may know. Mathieu's history is extraordinary. His father was the most famous philosopher in France, who wrote from memory a 2-volume history of Western philosophy. His mother was a great painter. If you can believe it, Mathieu learned photography from Henri Cartier-Bresson. He learned to play piano from Stravinsky. He learned anthropology at the feet of Claude Lévi-Strauss. He himself was a molecular biologist studying in the lab of a Nobel laureate at the Pasteur Institute. One day he realized there was no correlation between happiness, fame, and contentment. So he went back to the place he had always been happy and became ordained as a Tibetan monk. And you can see from this photograph that to be with Mathieu in the Himalaya was rather like being with Friar Tuck in Sherwood Forest. So we embarked on this journey to the heart with a close friend of mine, Shara Barma, a traditional Amshi doctor, looking here rather quizzically at my urine sample. And we were under the blessings of Trusik Rinpoche, the head of the Nyingma tradition, a teacher of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. And our goal was to meet a true hero, not the hero that we think of when it comes to Everest, these kind of insane European American climbers who deliberately fling themselves into a zone of death where oxygen deprivation alone obliterates consciousness, which from the Tibetan point of view is about the stupidest thing you can ever do with a precious incarnation. We wanted to go to be in the presence of a Tibetan hero, a bodhisattva, a woman who had liberated her being through devotion, but had remained in the realm of samsara to facilitate the liberation of other sentient creatures. This is a woman who was so beautiful when she was young that she had countless suitors, but she wanted only to pursue the Dharma, and Her family was so poor, they were forced to betroth her to this merchant. When the merchant came to claim her, she escaped by crawling down a latrine and, covered with human excrement, turned up at the feet of the abbot of Tembuchi Monastery, who cleaned her up and suggested that she go across the Nangpara, a 23,000-foot ice-encrusted pass to the west of Everest, and become ordained as a Tibetan nun, which she did. She then recrossed the pass and came to a nunnery near Tembuche, then became a Tsitsampa Ani. She went into lifelong retreat, living her entire life in a single cell, reciting a single mantra, a cell no bigger than the corner of this space here. And because she had become elderly, Sherab was treating her as a doctor. So this journey of the heart began at Shiwang, this monastery that clings like a swallow's nest to the edge of the Himalaya. We participated in the Manirindu ceremony, which remembers over 18 days the transmission of the Dharma to Tibet during the era of Guru Rinpoche. And then we began this movement to the mountain. Eventually, reaching the cave where Sherab, as part of his 7 years of medical training, had spent 1 year in solitary isolation, a cave to which he returns every year for a month of private meditation. And as Mathieu outside chanted the sutras, we found our way to Tembuche, and this next photograph was taken the instant the door opened on the face of a woman, a face that had not seen sunlight in 45 years. And by the terms of reference of our society, she should have been a madwoman. The face that greeted us radiated loving compassion. She immediately began to take Mathieu to task for the unnecessarily Baroque rituals that male monks pursued in the monasteries. And she said all that counts is the Dharma and the mantra. And it was an amazing moment because Mathieu said to me, this is the proof of the efficacy of the science of the mind, of the practitioner, the serenity achieved by the person who follows the contemplative practice. And later that day, a Lama said to me a wonderful thing. He said, you know, we in Tibet don't really believe you went to the moon, but you did. You may not believe that we achieve enlightenment in one lifetime, but we do. And so we ask ourselves finally, what kind of world do we want to live in? A polychromatic world of diversity or a monochromatic world of monotony? Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist, said before she died that her greatest fear was that as we drifted toward this blandly amorphous world, not only would the entire range of the human imagination be reduced to a more narrow modality of thought, but we'd wake one day as from a dream, having forgotten that there were other possibilities for life. The issue isn't the traditional versus the modern, it's the rights of free people to choose the components of their lives. The goal is not to freeze people in time or deny any people the benefits of the genius of the technological realm, but rather to ensure that we find ways that all peoples can benefit from those discoveries without that engagement demanding the death of their ethnicity. Because ultimately what anthropology teaches is that culture is not trivial. This is why ultimately it's a very conservative message. Culture is not decorative. It's not feathers and bells. It's not the songs we sing or the prayers we utter. Ultimately, culture is a body of ethical and moral values that every culture places around every human being to keep at bay the barbaric heart that history teaches us lies beneath the surface of every human being. It is culture that allows us to make sense out of sensation, find order and meaning in a universe that may have none, to do as Lincoln said, always seek the better angels of our nature. And if you want to know what happens when culture is lost, when individuals, either through volition or through coercion, turn their backs on their past, often aspiring to a level of wealth that will always be beyond them, only to secure a place in the lowest rung of an economic ladder that goes nowhere. You simply have to look at the consequences of disaffection and alienation that cause the flashpoints of horror all around the world. Culture is not trivial. It is a glue that allows a social species to thrive. And mercifully, nation states that at one point rejected this idea have now embraced it. When I was a young boy, Inuit people in Canada and First Nations were clearly second-class citizens. And when the British first arrived in the Arctic, they took the Inuit to be savages. The Inuit took the British to be gods. Both were wrong, but one did more to honor the human race. And there was no better measure, what the British failed to understand is that there was no better measure of genius in the ability to survive in a harsh environment when everything had to be forged from the cold or carved from bone. The Inuit didn't fear the cold, they took advantage of it. The runners of their sleds were originally made of fish, 3 Arctic char laid in a row and wrapped in the skin of a caribou hide. And when the British mimicked their ways, they achieved great feats of exploration, but mostly they persisted in importing their own environment with them, such that when the last of Lord Franklin's men were found frozen to death at Starvation Cove on the Adelaide Peninsula, the young sailors were dragging behind them a sled of oak and iron made in Manchester, England that weighed 500 pounds. On top of it was a dory from Franklin's ship that weighed 300 pounds. Inside the dory were all the accoutrements of a British naval officer's dinner service, including silver plate and a copy of the novel The Vicar of Wakefield. This they somehow expected to drag through the immense boreal forests of Canada to hit a Hudson Bay post and achieve salvation. Well, of course, they suffered terrible deaths, but the Inuit moved lightly on the land. This is a photograph I took polar bear hunting 250 miles on the ice from the Gloolik. That night the temperature dropped to -65 Celsius before the wind came up. And as the lads stayed out on the ice with the other fellas, I helped them make an igloo, and we simply crawled into the caribou hide skins, lit the oil lamps, and then ate meat. And despite what Greenpeace tells you about the Arctic, blood on ice in the Arctic is not a sign of death. It's an affirmation of life itself. And when I was narwhal hunting on the tip of Baffin Island, just to end with one wonderful tale, this man, Olayak, told me a great story from a dreadful period of Canadian history, the 1950s, when we forcibly moved the Inuit into settlements to establish our sovereignty as Canadians in an archipelago that could have gone back to the Europeans, or even more possibly to the Americans. And so the government forced the Inuit into settlements. His grandfather categorically refused to go, and so fearful for his life, Olayak and his father took away all of the grandfather's tools and weapons, thinking that that would force him into the settlements. Did it? No. Middle of an Arctic night with a blizzard blowing, the old man slipped outside the igloo, pulled down his caribou hide and sealskin trousers, and defecated into his hand. As the feces began to freeze, he shaped it in the form of an implement. When the implement made from human waste was forged by the cold, he put a spray of saliva along the leading edge and used the tool to kill a dog. He skinned the dog with it, improvised the traces of a sled with the skin of the dead dog, improvised a sled with the ribcage of the dead dog, and then what the Inuit call a ship knife in belt, he disappeared into the Arctic night. Now talk about getting by with nothing. It's kind of a wonderful symbol of the perseverance of Inuit culture, a perseverance that is exemplified in the northernmost community in the world of Konak. Here, if you go to Konak in northwest Greenland, you'll see a community with wonderful houses, everybody's got a DVD, everybody's got a cell phone, great clinic. What you won't see is a skidoo. You'll see 40,000 dogs, because in their wisdom they've understood the cultural pivot is a dog. And the act of training kids to work with dogs is the glue of their society. And so they have all the amenities of the modern world. They've kept this one anchor, their culture. And because of that, it's so much healthier than communities across the way in Baffin Island. The tragedy, of course, is now they're dealing, as all circumpolar people are dealing, with something beyond their control. That's climate change. The ice used to come in September, stay till July. Now it comes in November and is gone by March. The entire way of the Inuit is melting from beneath them. And everywhere we go in the world as ethnographers, we're finding indigenous people who played no role in the creation of climate change through ritual terms of reference of their own, trying desperately to do something about it because they think they are responsible for the well-being of the world. So it's a very poignant thing. So when I wrote this book called Wayfinders, and the editors plunked down the subtitle, Why Ancient Wisdom Matters in the Modern World, I had to answer that question, and I really did so in two words: climate change. Not to suggest that we go back to a pre-industrial past or that any society be kept from the genius of modernity, but rather to say that the very existence of these other cultures and other ways of being and thinking puts a lie to those amongst us who tell us that we cannot change, as we all know we must change, the fundamental way we interact with this precious planet. And in the end then, I leave you with the notion that we need the prayers of these young Tibetan monks. just like we need the hopes of this young kid from the Maasai and the Serengeti, because for all of us and for all time, their notions and beliefs, prayers, and songs are part of our collective geography of hope. Thank you very much.